I think it was a very good decision to go into a niche field like that, because personally I've never heard about the shipbreaking side of environmental law, environmental issues in general. So yeah, it's a very interesting field, and as you said, it impacts quite a lot, both on a humanitarian perspective, but also on environmental perspective. So there is a quite broad topic. Yes.
Yeah. I would say it's like, a lot of people, ask me, are you crazy? 6 year working on this small topic. Actually, it looks very specific. It looks niche, but it's really cross-cutting. And actually, people are surprised to discover how it is interlinked with a lot of issues, from transparency in the shipping industry to finance, to trade, to human rights, to environmental protection. So yeah,
Yes.
I at least on a personal point of view, I find it extremely interesting, and it's also in a way a big challenge, in the sense that I have this desire to raise awareness on a topic that is not yet well known to the masses, to the general public, and it should, because we're still talking about roughly 1,000 ships every year that are scrapped on 3 single beaches in Bangladesh, in India, and in Pakistan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today's live. Today we are here with Nicola. Thanks, Nicola, for joining, and we will be talking about his background, his experience in the environmental sector, in particular the working with the NGO Shipbreaking Platform. And we will link today's talk with yesterday's talk with Marina, which, if you followed, basically, yes, we discussed about the role of international organizations, and the link, let's say, with NGOs, more on a regulatory perspective from the European Commission, the United Nations. So today we will see more the practical perspective of the reporting from NGOs to international organizations and everything else. So thanks, Nicola, for joining, and I let you give a brief introduction to yourself, and where did you start?
Yeah, thanks, Tani, and hi, everyone. First of all, I can thank you for the invitation, and congratulations for this great initiative as well. So I grew up in the same region as Daniele, in a little corner northeast in Italy, in a small city called Udine. I did a high school there, and I also graduated bachelor and master in law. I had an experience abroad back in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, time passes by very quickly. I did an exchange program, the Erasmus program in Portugal, in Coimbra. I stayed there for 10 months, and I would say that experience really changed my life in a very positive way, and basically changed the way I approached life, and in general, live this world. I mean, I strongly believe that experiences abroad for a certain type of people can be really life-changing, and a massive improvement, and an opportunity for development, not only from an academic, professional point of view, but also from a personal point of view, in terms of personal growth. After I graduated the bachelor and master in law, well, it was clear to me that I didn't want a career as a lawyer, for several factors. Let's say partially depending on the person I am, and what I was, let's say, striving for, and my goals and my ambitions. And partially because also the let's say market in Italy is not, let's say, that's great if you want to become a lawyer, in a qualified lawyers, in the sense that the market is saturated. There are way too many lawyers, so it's not an easy path to basically decide to go on. So I try to do some jobs here and there, including a volunteering experience, thanks to personal connections in Brazil at a law firm. A quick experience of a couple of weeks. But then I decided to pursue, let's say, further academic development and go for another master. I applied actually for different type of master, because you never know if you manage to
Yes.
to get registered for these kind of programs. So I recall that I applied for a master in international environmental law at the University of Stockholm, and then a master in international economic business law in Groningen in the Netherlands, and one in Tilburg, also in the Netherlands. And I ended up being accepted both in Tilburg and Groningen, and then I opted for Groningen, where I studied international economic and business law. And very soon I realized that maybe it was not really my cup of tea. I mean, all those subjects. So I decided actually to take some extra courses, voluntary courses, for instance, seminars on what I thought was a very interesting area of the law, which is like human rights and environmental law. And that's basically how then, let's say, my experience and my knowledge a bit shifted from, let's say, European international law and, let's say, private law and economic and business law, more towards the environmental and human rights part of it.
Just to give a little background, I've met Nicola. Well, it was like when I had to move to Groningen for my bachelor's degree. I was looking for a room, so I found that Nicola was giving away his room, and was lucky that we were both Italians, and we I could manage to get a room also that way, let's say.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
And so you studied there, and then you realized that business law it was not for you, and you went more into humanitarian and environmental law.
Yes. Yes, definitely. I guess also a big, let's say, factor was played by this seminar I took on international environmental law. And during the first class, the teacher, the professor, showed us a short introductory video on different environmental issues that back then in 2013 were not all over the news, quite niche issues such as space debris, space pollution, or desertification. And there were also like a couple of seconds on shipbreaking. So this issue I never heard about. So basically how vessels, ocean-going ships, cruise ships, tankers, container ships are scrapped, are recycled at end of life. And there was like this short few seconds when basically the filmmaker was showing these stretches of muddy beaches where all the ships, all the vessels were lined up and scrapped, broken apart with bare hands by kids and also workers without protective equipment. I mean, I also passionate about photography, so it was like the visual impact was massive, and I got immediately curious about it, and I decided to do some research about the topic, and I found a way to basically write my thesis on shipbreaking. Even though again I was attending a program on economic and business law, I managed to find a link and actually develop a thesis. And SAL research based on this link between business law and an environmental human rights issue such as shipbreaking. Specifically, I focused on the relationship between financial institutions and ship recycling yards, ship recycling facilities. So how basically banks are financing this business. Yeah, the dismantling of ships. So was, I would say, a topic that was not well researched before I did my thesis, and I would say that that's something that helped me find the job that I have now. Because inevitably I had to ask the NGO Shipbreaking Platform, which is the only NGO in the world that exclusively deals with the issue of shipbreaking. I had to ask for their assistance in terms of like, you know, research material, or like if I had specific questions and needed clarification. And then, quite shamelessly, I asked them if, you know, they have like a position they were interested in having me even as an intern. And that's how I moved, you know, from Groningen to Brussels straight away, thanks to the decision I took in terms of like, you know, choosing the topic for my thesis. Yeah.
I think it was a very good decision to go into a niche field like that, because personally I've never heard about the shipbreaking side of environmental law, environmental issues in general. So yeah, it's a very interesting field, and as you said, it impacts quite a lot, both on a humanitarian perspective but also on environmental perspective. So there is a quite broad topic. Yes.
Yeah, I would say it's like, you know, a lot of people, you know, ask me, are you crazy? 6 years working on this small topic. Actually, it looks very specific. It looks niche, but it's really cross-cutting. And actually, people are surprised to discover how it is interlinked with a lot of issues, you know, from transparency in the shipping industry to finance, to trade, you know, to human rights, to environmental protection. So yeah,
Yes.
I at least on a personal point of view, I find it extremely interesting, and it's also in a way a big challenge in the sense that I have this desire to raise awareness on a topic that is not yet well known to the masses, to the general public, and it should, because we're still talking about roughly 1,000 ships every year that are scrapped on 3 single beaches in Bangladesh, in India, and in Pakistan.
Yes.
And the shipping companies that sometimes we see docked at the ports in our cities are the same shipping companies that provide, you know, 90% of the goods we use and consume, and the same shipping companies that sell ships to be scrapped under unacceptable conditions on the beaches of South Asia.
Yeah, I've read about the topic, and several companies write that it's a sustainable way to recycle material from these ships. But on the other side, it causes these issues which are not that covered by the media, or anyway, they are not that exposed to the public.
Yeah, I guess, you know, maybe it might be useful that I give a bit of background. Is like in terms of like where does you know, shipbreaking place itself in a whole context, broad context, not only the legal one, but let's say the economic context, so that also our viewers can understand better. So we are in the context, in the kingdom of toxic trade in the end of the day. Nowadays, you know, its products are mainly made in certain parts of the world, for instance, Asia. They are consumed, used in the global north, so by the Western world mainly, and then they are sold or sent back as waste, often hazardous waste, to Asia again. So a lot of companies see this system as, you know, circular. Products are made in Asia, we use them, we send back there. Actually, there's nothing circular in this, because this model basically ignores 2 major pillars, which are basically natural capital, in the sense that instead of really focusing, we are exclusively focusing, you know, on reuse, recycling, without really tackling the main problem, which is overproduction. We keep producing products and goods, no matter how, you know, toxic, useless, or you know, stupid they are. And we also ignore another major pillar, which is the externalization of costs at the expenses of vulnerable communities and the environment on the other side of the world, in the global south. I mean, as human beings, we are very smart, and we were also very smart in creating these pollution events located strategically in the global south. And companies clearly brand this as something helpful, something useful for these economies, these weaker economies, and these vulnerable communities.
Underdeveloped countries, for example.
Absolutely, and you know, we are selling our waste, so it's a way for them to make an income, you know, to earn money. Well, you know, you might be right that reusing, recycling, reconverting products is positive, and yeah, poor people are able to get a job in this way. However, I mean, we have to keep in mind that waste can also be a threat if not handled and disposed in a proper way. And then, like, very quickly, what was called job turns out to be exploitation. And that's why we are in the context of toxic trade, which is in a way, if you want, a new form of colonialism, a toxic colonialism. So examples of this toxic colonialism is not only shipbreaking, and I guess we will talk more about this issue, but also the electronic waste, the e-waste dumps in China and in Ghana, for instance. Or also another very peculiar and curious example that involves our homeland is the cocoa case that dates back to 1988. When 5 ships transported 8,000 barrels of hazardous waste from Italy to a small town in Nigeria, a small town called Coco, in exchange for $100 monthly rent, which was paid to a farmer, a Nigerian farmer, for the use of his farmland to store these 8,000 barrels of toxic waste that this Italian businessman didn't want to dispose in a proper way in Europe. And suddenly the toxics start leaking, poisoning not only the environment, the soil, but also intoxicating an entire community. And this is just, you know, one of the first, you know, striking example of toxic colonialism, or toxic trade, how basically global North, Western companies try to exploit vulnerable communities and pollute the environment that is so far away, you know, from their lands, from their countries, and also like in a way circumvent laws or exploit loopholes in the legislation.
Yes, they dispose. I mean, the Western world disposes of this waste to an underdeveloped country, like in exchange of it's a very convenient for them, but it doesn't give good results. Obviously, yes. And I was wondering, yours is the only NGO active in this sector, as you said. So is it actually effective? How effective it is in the shipbreaking field?
So just to be precise, like we are a coalition of organizations. So we have 18 organizations that are our members, and all NGOs working on environmental issues or human rights issues. And I'm working at the secretariat in Brussels. Basically, our member organization support us on some activities and some actions we do. But in the end of the day, let's say 90% of the work on shipbreaking is done at the secretariat level. So I'm talking about research work, I'm talking about policy work, advocacy work, and naming and shaming, which is a big part of what we do. And yes, we are the leading coalition on this issue, and the only organization working exclusively on this topic. We exist since 2006, and I would say that we are quite effective for being such a small an NGO. Just to give you an idea, in the last year, for a while, it was just me and my colleague, the founder and director of of the platform, the NGO Shipbreaking Platform. So just 2 people. Now we are back at full regime with 4. But it's a lot of work still for 4 staff members. So
Yes.
I guess that we've been quite affected in the last years in terms of which type of tools and legal tools legislation we were able to secure. We successfully pushed for a new regulation at European level on ship recycling, which was adopted in 2013, entered into force in 2013, and now it became applicable last year, at the beginning of last year. We are also very active on trying to stop all these illegal trades of ships. Unfortunately, in most of the cases, we know that the ship reached the beach, so when it's already too late, so we cannot really stop this illegal export from taking place. But sometimes, thanks to whistleblowers or research work that I personally do and the team does, is like we are able to detect ships that are still, for instance, in European waters before they illegally depart towards these South Asian beaches. So we are able to alert authorities. And how it goes. There are authorities from certain countries that are more willing, to act and stop this illegal export, and other authorities that are less willing to do so for lack of resources, lack of willingness, who knows, lack of knowledge sometimes as well. But, we have also been successful in halting high-profile ships that were about to illegally depart from our waters in Europe, for instance.
Now, how does that work? If I can ask, how do you find out if these ships have an intention to illegally dispose of waste coming from the West?
Yeah, indeed, the ship itself configures as waste. So basically, what is waste is actually the ship itself. So normally these ships are empty,
Right.
but then they are considered hazardous waste according to international and European law because they contain within their structures hazardous substances such as oil sludges, PCBs, mercury, copper, asbestos. So that's why they are, let's say a toxic bomb in a way. That if they're not disposed and cut properly, then all these toxics are poisoning, intoxicating the workers, and also these toxics are released into the environment. And in these 3 beaches, in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, basically there are no containment measure to prevent pollution, and also workers, are often, risking their lives. We also try to document what are the human costs of this business, and unfortunately we document dozens of people that die or get severely injured every day. So how do we manage to know that the ship is leaving? Well, sometimes there are articles in magazines where the ship owner itself, the shipping companies themselves actually announce that the ship is going for breaking. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, we receive some tips from whistleblowers, so confidential sources that inform us, look, I know that these guys are planning to, scrap a ship soon, so try to stop it. And sometimes it's just our desk research work based on databases. So shipping database that basically map the movements in real time of the 60,000 plus ships that are out there roaming our oceans. So yeah, you also have to be in a way lucky sometimes to just monitor at the right time these movements, and most of the time, as I said, authorities are not able to act also because ship owners are getting, let's say, smarter and smarter in the sense that they are really able to use the loopholes in the law and basically lie to authorities using registration in post box companies, in tax havens, and using middlemen to basically distance themselves from the sale of the ship and render the tracing of the last voyage of the ship more difficult for authorities and for us as well.
So for the majority of cases, you still find ships that are already at the destination shipyard.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say 95%.
Okay.
Still,
And then
yes.
must be quite problematic when they are in territorial waters of other countries. How do you interact with local governments in that?
Yes, yes. I mean, when we are talking about, let's say, outside Europe, inevitably there's one particular legislation that kicks in, which is the Basel Convention on transboundary movement of hazardous waste. And there are the so-called Basel focal points that are basically nominated, appointed authorities in every country that have the task to implement and enforce the law. So every time we know that the ship is going through territorial waters of the state, we alert the Basel focal point of that specific country. And then, yeah, it's just a matter of
collaboration,
exactly. And sometimes, so this, I mean, it's not rare that we inform authorities, and actually authorities are surprised about the fact that the Basel Convention applies to end-of-life ships, because they never had such a case before. So there's a lot of also work from our part to basically brief them on the legal content and on the legal rules that are, let's say, relevant for that specific case. So it's a bit of a paradox that sometimes we have to teach authorities how to apply the law. And yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. So there's a quite good interaction, let's say, with from NGOs in general to I don't know, is it part of the United Nations or for
yes,
the European Commission, for example, or European
authority?
Yeah,
so I guess we deal with really different type of actors out there, so stakeholders. I mean, from as I said, regional organs and bodies such as the European Union, so like the Parliament, the Commission, the Council. We also deal with member states in Europe themselves, and also countries, located outside Europe. So with authorities, national authorities, such as these Basel focal points. We also deal with the UN. So there's actually, I would say, main two bodies that are working on this are the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and also the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. And then, as I guess every other organization, it's really a matter of how effective is your communication channel and your relationship with this type of bodies. There are bodies or stakeholders that are more willing to talk to you in a very cooperative collaboration, let's say, mood, and others that are really not willing to cooperate. And I mean, it really depends. If you're really working a lot on this topic, especially also on shipping, you will see that we're talking about, let's say, first of all, companies that have accumulated, let's say, as much, especially container shipping companies that have accumulated as much debt as a mid-sized country, that emit as much CO2 as a big country, and have difficulties to be profitable, yet basically they do not really consider their own responsibility. So they keep insisting on privacy, on lack of transparency, on opacity, on offshoring. So basically, the governments of the countries where the shipping companies are based are not, receiving any money from these companies, because these companies are not paying, taxes. They're all using this offshoring system.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like an industry that claims and wants to be different from all other industry, and that's completely unacceptable. And then if you start, even analyzing how certain UN bodies work, well, then you might have even some doubts how well crafted these organs are. The IMO, for instance, is completely industry driven. It lacks transparency, and it's all, the whole shipping system is also based on these old flags of convenience system, which if you think about it, and if you start researching about it, it's really mind-blowing. How is it possible that, in the 21st century we are still talking about a system that facilitates and encourages opacity and privacy and lack of transparency?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's also easy for this company to really push for more and more greenwashing, also to counter argue our position and our campaign.
And this situation often leads to lawsuits. Is that correct? Because of situations where you flag out publicly the name of companies that act in this way, or other situations, you are quite exposed to lawsuits for I don't know, defamation or a situation like that.
Yeah, so indeed, we are working now with other NGOs specifically on SLAP cases. SLAP are basically strategic lawsuits against public participation. So are these basically lawsuits that are filed by the companies that normally journalists and NGOs expose, and they are not really intended, to they are not based on really actual merit, but they're just intended to censor or intimidate or silence basically civil society. And they can really become an obstacle and a burden on a day-to-day workings of an NGO or let's say a magazine or a newspaper, because the cost of legal defense might be very high. And also, again, I underline the fact that the plaintiff, so the person that really files these cases or this case, it does not normally expect to win this lawsuit. So it's really intended like a system to just keep creating problem for you that dare to expose their wrongdoings. And it's also a matter of, let's say, freedom of expression. Yes. And they normally take place in form of defamation lawsuits. So you are definitely right in mentioning that. And yeah, as an organization, we're also facing one of these SLAP lawsuit at the moment.
So would you say, the protection of NGOs and people expressing their ideas in this field, let's say, is not yet completely developed? Would you say that, or?
Absolutely. It's basically at European level, we're pushing for a new legislation that is gonna, let's say, guarantee the protection of activists and NGOs. There are some initiatives at this moment covering journalists, but it's enough to read about this Caruana Galizia case in Malta. This famous investigative journalist that was murdered a few years ago for basically uncovering the murky business going on in Malta, related to some of the stakeholders there. And then at the time of that, she was also facing an enormous amount of lawsuits, SLAP cases that were intended to basically block her and stop her from further investigation. So yes, the answer is there's a lot more that can be done to basically improve the protection of journalists and NGOs as well.
Yes, in terms of protection of the rights of freedom of expression and that kind of field, I was thinking about the recent case with Donald Trump that sued I think an author of a book that mentioned that claimed that he was not a billionaire or something like that. Like,
There was one actually. It's a typical, case study in a way that when you talk about SLAPs, you mention it. Now it was like, I guess, roughly 8 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. But several years ago, one of the first examples, or like, let's say the most striking examples of SLAP cases, where you sue someone just because called you a millionaire, and actually you think you're a billionaire. So that's very crazy.
Word.
And I believe that Trump itself declared that the intention was really not to win the case, but just make a point and create some troubles and some problems for the journalist or the author. The writer in question. So
actually, maybe tomorrow the London Talk will receive a lawsuit for mentioning this. So.
Well, I totally hope not.
No, anyway, I was wondering more on a career point of view, like the life cycle of NGOs, and like you depend on funds essentially. So you would say is a bit uncertain career or a difficult career? Like, how would you
Yeah.
explain that?
I guess it really depends on the type of NGOs you're working for. So yesterday, your guest mentioned how it's useful for your let's say professional development and your CV as well to have an experience in small NGOs.
Yes.
I mean, work for a small NGO. And yes, you have responsibilities that you might not have in bigger NGOs. You might end up doing way more things that your title on paper says. I have a background in law, but in the end of the day, I take care of legal issues, policy issues, communication issues, admin issues. So it's very, let's say, rewarding in terms of professional development. At the same time, I think that it really depends on your personal goals. I would say that small NGOs are less. I don't want to generalize, but a lot of small NGOs are less stable financially compared to big NGOs. I mean, it's our case that we really depend on European funding. Which accounts to basically 60% roughly of our budget. And there are grants. We receive an operational grant from the European Commission, DG Environment, every 2 years. But again, every 2 years you have to apply for it, and there's a big uncertainty whether you will get it or not. And again, we're talking about a big chunk of our budget. So as you can imagine, it's something that is not sure. So also in terms of how you can really plan your personal life, it can be a challenge for some people. So I guess you have to be built in a way in terms of, let's say, personality and how you see the world and your life, and you have to be prepared to the possibility that you might not have this job soon. Fortunately, it also depends on how effective you are, how invested you are. And I also strongly believe that if you want something, most of the time you get it, in terms of like, yes, we are striving, we want funding, we need money, then yeah, we will manage somehow. And, it also depends on how effective you are on your day-to-day job and as an organization. So if you are a successful NGO that is making an impact, and I believe that we are an NGO making an impact, then in a way the money comes because also donors see how you as an organization can really shift a specific industry or a specific sector or a specific topic towards better horizons.
Yes. And I was wondering how effective are NGOs in general, or the shipbreaking platform in terms of in a legal perspective, let's say, winning the cases that you're against companies, against those involved in this shipbreaking activity.
I think we have been quite successful because some of the cases we alerted authorities about ended up being prosecuted by these local authorities. And there's an example of this first criminal indictment that took place in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands in 2018, when a company, the Sea Trade shipping company, was found guilty for the intention of scrapping ships illegally in South Asia, ships that were located in European waters at the time, so violating the EU Waste Shipment Regulation, which is the transposition of the Basel Convention into European law. And that resulted in heavy fines for the company, and also the suspension of let's say high-level professional within the company from exercising their profession for a certain amount of time. There are also currently other investigations ongoing in UK, in Norway, in Belgium. So there was also recently a judgment in November from the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, declaring that illegal an import of a radioactive contaminated ship that was illegally exported by probably the biggest shipping company, which is Maersk, and Odebrecht, which is also another Brazilian shipping giant, was illegally exported from UK, containing norm, which is naturally occurring radioactive material, which is a substance that is really dangerous for the health of our planet and the workers. And we also, so shipping companies face these legal risks, let's say, the risk being prosecuted for their illegal activities. They risk, like reputational damages due to our naming and shaming. But also lately we've been cooperating with a law firm in UK, actually. Leday is called. Leday is basically representing workers that have been injured during the process of cutting these ships, or families of deceased workers, in basically trying to seek compensation directly from the shipping company that sold these vessels. So I guess also another risk that the shipping companies can face is also these compensation claims that can arise if you didn't really take care about the end-of-life management of your fleet.
So there is a compensation scheme based on national laws, or is it at the European level?
No, in that case, it's a UK law. It's based on UK law, so there has to be a UK link, basically.
So would you say that, for example, bigger companies have more leeway or more activity in this kind of field, or is it more smaller companies that are not well known that try to?
That's a very interesting question. I would say this is rather a mix. So you have a lot of unknown companies, specifically located in this
mixed activity,
shipping countries such as Greece, or Indonesia or Japan, South Korea, Germany, and then you have these big players. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of shipping companies that have a good policy. So at the moment, there are maybe dozens of companies that clearly state in their policy that they do not sell ships to yards, facilities located on the beaches, for, of course, obvious environmental and let's say health and safety reasons. And the actually curious fact is that shipping companies get a lot of money out of selling these ships to the beaches, but they would still get a lot of money out of selling these ships to proper ship recycling yards that we have in Europe, and that unfortunately are underutilized. So we have a lot of, as you can imagine, ports in every port city that could potentially reconvert or perform, ship recycling operations. And that could also boost, in a way, the creation of green jobs and the whole aspect of the circular economy in Europe, especially now in light of this new EU Green Deal. So, it's a pity that, again, most of ship owners, most of shipping companies just opt for top dollar, in a way. So they just care, in the end of the day, about money and what comes in their pocket, without taking into account that it's not about just the money, but also the human and environmental costs related to, of course, to the whole process.
Yes, it's very, very interesting indeed. And I'd have a last question. Actually, if anyone else has other questions in the chat, you can let us know. And what advice would you give to students or young professionals that want to enter NGOs rather than a career in a law firm, for example? Because many want to try, the two sides of international law and national law. perhaps?
Well, I would say that the best thing, if you don't really know what to do, try both.
Yeah.
It's like if you can. I definitely, I mean, I define myself as an activist. Sometimes people think like, oh, that's a negative label. Well, I don't see it as negative. I'm proud and I define myself as an activist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as every job, you need to be passionate about, and there are pros and cons inevitably with every job. If you go and work for these big law firms, probably, that your, let's say, free time and work time and the balance
Exactly,
might not be ideal, that you end up really working a lot. And again, working for an NGO, it might entail that the cons are the fact that you don't have a certain stability if you work for a small organization. But I would definitely recommend to have this experience, especially in light of the fact that NGOs often, you can really see on a day-to-day basis that you have a lot of impact. I mean, your work that you do on a daily basis results in really tangible, concrete outcomes.
Changes,
I've been reading recently an article in The Guardian that clearly basically proves and shows how NGOs were way more effective than governmental organizations or religious institution in distributing food during the COVID-19 pandemic in India. So, that's, something not a lot of people believe in or think, that, NGOs can be really effective in what they do. I can really provide, let's say, game-changing, and life-changing, let's say, efforts and to population and to the environment in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, I think many people are usually skeptical on the activity of NGOs because they don't have a tangible link to their activities, or they don't see what happens in practice or how the funds are used on the field. But you're saying it's quite effective eventually, and
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's all from my side. I don't know if you have anything else to add. Otherwise, we can.
No, it's good. And again, if some of you have like some questions, feel free to reach out to Danny, and then he will let me know. And I'm glad to reply to your questions, clarification if you need some. Yeah.
Thank you all. Hi, Andreas. He's saying hi.
Hey, hi, Andreas.
Thanks for following. See you. Bye. Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.
Bye. Bye.